Hello, I'm John Walker. I'm Director of Security Research at Beyond Trust. And I think that the focus of my talk is on defense in depth when it comes to an identity. I think that's an area where we often neglect that. The title can be a bit confusing, but that's kind of what the focus is. There's a picture of me there. But now, I think my starting point is I think I've worked in the industry generally for a couple of decades now. I think like by kind of temperament or originally a bit more on the offensive side, but I think over the last decade spent a lot of time trying to keep environments safe or help other people do that. And I think my takeaway from doing that is that especially when it comes to the cloud, the SaaS kind of things beyond on-prem, that as an industry we're kind of losing versus attackers. And I say that because if you look at like the visibility on cyber risk, right, or cybersecurity risk, the money being invested, the products being built, the people working in that industry, all that stuff is increasing. But year over year, the outcomes of things that attackers do, their impact continues to increase. So while we're being, given more and more resources to keep the people that we keep safe, the impact of attackers is actually getting, greater, not less. And so I think, from my perspective, that means that we're effectively losing. I think that when I talk to other people who work in the industry, that's something that tends to resonate with some of them, not all of them. But I think it's a much longer thing there to kind of exactly go through the numbers and exactly are we losing, how are we losing, all those things. But I think to some extent or another, we can definitely agree that attackers are accelerating, and we're not necessarily keeping up with them, especially when it comes to SaaS, cloud, all these sorts of new areas that we're responsible for defending. So I think as someone who spent a lot of time, doing that defensive work, I've also spent a lot of time wondering, why it is that this is so difficult for us, and that kind of literally every day of the year, right, there's some major breach or another, including in places that have fairly mature security practices. And I think one thing that's relevant, that we're all kind of aware of is the move from on-prem to the cloud, to SaaS, to all these things. There's no more physical security perimeter. There's no more network security perimeter. Kind of an obvious change in what we have to defend. But I think the thing that sticks out to me beyond that is when you look at the attacks that do breach, all these new things that we have to defend. I think again and again and again, the pattern that you see is there's really one mistake is all it took to get the entire environment breached. And I think as long as that's kind of the equation, it's just a matter of time before we're breached, basically. And very obvious example of that is all the Snowflake-related breaches this year. So you see like Ticketmaster and things like that. And basically what that was info stealers have been collecting Snowflake credentials for years, and attackers just didn't know what they do with them. They were just passed around the dark web, right? And no one had bothered to try to log into these Snowflake instances. And so some attacker somewhere is the first one to log in and sees, oh wait, by logging in, put in one password, one place, I now have access to this company's entire data set. And so they create a little tool that you plug in the password to, and it goes and logs in for you and downloads all the data. And then as a result of that, roughly between 100 and 150 companies had their data stolen, Ticketmaster being one of the high-profile ones. For every one of those companies, though, they basically made one mistake. One employee at one point in the last few years got their credentials stolen for Snowflake, just that one application. And the result of that was kind of a catastrophic data exfiltration, essentially. And I think that's kind of represented. I think in some attacks, it's a little bit more obfuscated that it really was just one mistake. But when you really go through it, it's often like, oh, there's one thing went wrong, and there were not posture controls in place to add another layer of defense there. And I think that's really, the heart of why we fail. It's not just that we're defending more things. It's that we don't apply the kind of timeless principles we know to be true, which are, take care of the posture, add multiple layers of defense so that it's not a case where one mistake is the thing that costs us, or even multiple mistakes, right? Because we're all human on the defense side, and we're going to make mistakes. We have to kind of plan for that. And I think this actually, it's kind of a negative thing, but it's a huge opportunity for us, right? Because when it comes to detection, we're right up against, the state of what's possible, right? Applying ML and AI, seeing how fast we can move data around, rapidly detect things, like really doing some great stuff in that space. When it comes to posture, especially for identity, we barely even scratched the surface of the basics. And the basics are really enough to actually stop a lot of the attacks that we see, right? So we're kind of like, there's potential there, right? There's an easy opportunity to improve what we do by taking care of the basics in this area rather than getting, we want to continue to get even better on detection, even better at these other things. But why not, shore up the area that we're kind of weak in. And so kind of before jumping into some of the anti-patterns that I'm going to talk about, which are anti-patterns because I think they erode defense in depth when it comes to identity, and they make us one mistake away, often in ways that we kind of don't even realize. I'm going to walk through a somewhat more complex attack than a snowflake one, which is enter a password, steal the data. Many attacks are that simple now in the kind of the SaaS cloud world, but one that's been presented as something more complex. But it actually is just a kind of one mistake attack. I'm going to walk through that, and I'm going to, at each point in the kill chain, kind of talk about the one simple identity control that would have stopped the whole thing, potentially. It's obviously a little bit speculative, and that's kind of Microsoft was breached by Russia at the end of 2023. They got into Exchange, monitored all the emails, and just sat there, kind of collecting information, presumably for the Russian government or someone. And so, we've all probably heard about that attack to some extent. I'm going to walk through it, looking at it from this kind of controls perspective. So the first step in that breach, attackers had a list of passwords they knew were potentially compromised or might be used in the Microsoft environments, and they sprayed them out at Microsoft Azure tenants until they found an account that used one of those credentials. So first step there, already even Azure, think about, well, these passwords were known to be compromised. Azure itself has Microsoft, Entra password protection. There's a million versions of these sort of have policy in place that don't allow people to use passwords that are known to be compromised, known weak. Already a control that potentially stops at least this initial access vector, and it's native to Microsoft stack here. And I should point out, not kind of trying to tear down Microsoft or something, just because they're actually a leader in this field. They've published the details of this breach, and says, here's all the things, here's how we fixed them. So just kind of taking advantage of what they've shared with us there to go through this, but not, I think these mistakes are in a lot of our environments. So already from the beginning, some strong password controls potentially prevent that initial foothold. So we see the attacker logs in, they find out there's no MFA, there's no conditional access policy that requires them to log in from a managed workstation or from a particular geo or something like that. They find out they're able to log in, and they're in kind of a sandbox Azure tenant. So kind of second opportunity there, with requiring MFA, requiring access from managed devices, all those boring basics, if that had been applied to these accounts, the kind of the attack stops there. But in this case, those are not applied, so the attacker logs in. They look at the privilege, using the privilege they have, they start enumerating all the service principals in the account, the privilege they have. They find the service principal, kind of tied to enterprise application that actually has the privilege to reach out into a real production tenant from this kind of sandbox tenant. And they find out that they're able to gain control of that second service principal from the original account they've compromised. And so that's kind of their second step, is moving to, via an enterprise application, a second service principal with more privilege. And so again, some basic controls there. We don't know all the specifics, but we know they were able to log into this kind of unused account that had a fair amount of privilege. It was able to let them enumerate all these things and take control of the second account. And then they found the service principal in a sandbox tenant that had the privilege to manipulate the users in a real production tenant. And so we kind of wonder, we don't know the specifics here, but how much of these privileges were actually required, right? Especially if some of these accounts were unused. And so potentially by not having the controls to verify that the privilege is actually required and necessary, missed opportunity there to stop the breach. So they're on their second hop now. They're controlling the service principal that has some production access. They use it to do two things, basically. They create an account in the production tenant, and then in the compromised sandbox tenant, they create an Azure enterprise application, and the enterprise application is going to ask for one permission, which is full, I think it's called full access app or something like that, full access as app to the EWS API that relate, to the Exchange API. And so they then log themselves into the production tenant, and they grant access to that app, to the production tenant. And that one permission that comes with that app, that the user is approving, that full access as app, it's kind of a little bit of an unknown permission or a little bit of an odd permission, right? But it's effectively, kind of on the same level as a domain admin type thing. What that allows you to do via this kind of EWS API is read every message in the Exchange server, regardless of who they come from, where they're going to, kind of a pretty sweeping level of access, kind of caught up in this one simple API permission. So at this point, they've now achieved their objectives. They're 3 steps down the kill chain and they're done, and they just sit back and just collect emails at this point. And here, even at this last step, we kind of see lots of weird privilege manipulation going on here, right? This very, very powerful privilege, being granted to an odd enterprise application that just got created by another enterprise, or service principal got created by another service principal. We see a user being created in the production tenant in a weird way by a service principal. Lots of weird things here happening about how privilege is being created and assigned, and lots of opportunities there where if there have been controls in place that say, well, if privilege is being changed, it must be from these sets of users, from managed IPs, from managed devices, and we're going to monitor that very carefully and look for anything unusual, like a new app being created, immediately assigned permissions that give it the full rights to read everyone's email, and then being a new user then being created in a production tenant that then brings that newly created app into that tenant where it immediately starts reading email. Like all those things, kind of a bit odd, right? And some basic posture controls, some basic visibility on privilege manipulation potentially stops that attack in its tracks. And the interesting thing there is, it's a sophisticated attack on some level, nation state threat actor, some unfamiliar things for, I guess maybe not at this conference, but some places, Azure service principles, that's all scary stuff we don't know a lot about. Obviously not the case here, but basic identity controls prevent, potentially, if just one of those basic identity controls is in place, stops the whole thing. So I think that's kind of where I'm going with the rest of this here, is because we all know the value of defense in depth. We all know the value of posture. It's discussed to death, right? But for whatever reason, we kind of fail to really apply it, especially in the, in this cloud SaaS space. And we often do. I would say the Microsoft breach is a one mistake breach. Someone got that credential. Every step they took there, it requires a little bit about Azure service principles and stuff. You could put a playbook together, and a teenager could do that in a half hour or so. The problem is teenagers don't happen to maybe know what service principles are offhand or something, but the complexity of the attack is very low. It's potentially a one mistake attack in my book. So I think, but we know this, and we know that defenses in depth is important. But then we tend to not, we do it like with on-prem or certain, detection and stuff, we tend to be a little bit better at it. When it comes to identity, we often kind of, and sometimes in compromising with businesses who need, they can only have so much friction, for their business objectives and so on. We sometimes subtly introduce kind of anti-patterns that erode this defense in depth in ways that are not obvious to us and create situations where, we're kind of one mistake away from breach. So I'm going to go through 4 anti-patterns, but really they're just all about what are the things that we do wrong that, that erode defense in depth, make it a one mistake away situation. So very simple one, poorly implemented MFA. MFA is maybe like, it's the kind of the classic second layer of defense, right? And that is that for a reason. It's very easy to implement, very effective. There's a reason why we focus so much on it. But I think what we don't realize is there's a ton of mistakes we can make when implementing MFA that make it so it's still some level of protection, but not at all that thing that we're kind of relying on, right? I think often talking to customers and clients and things like that, I talk about a risk to credentials or something like that, and their response is immediately, oh, I have MFA, I don't have to worry about that. Like, partly true, but really how you set up MFA has a big impact on whether it really is a second layer of defense. Very simple kind of mistake that a lot of people make is they read about hardware MFA, FIDO2 stuff. It's really the only effective defense we have against phishing, all forms of phishing right now. And they think, oh, that's a good thing. I'm going to add that for my privileged users. But it's not uncommon for them to also add like a backup factor like SMS or something like that, or allow users to register their own factors, which may not necessarily be hardware factor. And the reality is, as soon as you do that, the protection level on that account is not hardware MFA, it's SMS-based MFA, which is SIM swapping is commonplace nowadays. Like SMS is not really all that effective as MFA. And so attackers can just choose the weaker one, or if it's an attacker in the middle kind of phishing scenario, they could make a fake error message that says, oh, hardware MFA is not working. Can you just, use your other factor, or all sorts of things like that. So very basic thing, for a given account, we want to think of the effective MFA level as being the weakest MFA available. A lot of us probably, a lot of people kind of already on top of that, but that's kind of a basic thing that erodes that second layer. Another, somewhat more, some people, get that one right, but then when they're considering how they're implementing MFA, they're really focused on the state, what factors exist currently, right? And when the thing I'd argue you should be focusing on is the policy. Does my authentication policy require, for accounts that should have hardware MFA, does it actively require that in order to authenticate, you must present hardware MFA, regardless of what's going on with individual accounts and their factors? And then beyond that, have I actually verified that the policy has the effect I intend? And so that does a number of things, right? Threat actors like Scattered Spider, they've been responsible for breaching, a bunch of major casinos, LastPass, Twilio, or not Twilio, but yeah, LastPass, literally hundreds of major companies. They're really a group of kind of like teenagers, 20-somethings in the U.S. and the U.K. rely heavily on social engineering because they don't have, they have a native, they have accents that are, they kind of sound like kind of people that help desk type people would read as legitimate. So they would call the help desk and say, can you reset all the factors for me? And of course, help desks want to be helpful, and they do that, right? And so if you don't have a policy in place that says the only thing allowed for authentication is hardware MFA, they can just call the help desk and say, oh, I'm traveling and I forgot my YubiKey. Can you put an SMS factor on for me for the time being? And of course, yeah, this is the sort of thing that happens, right? Or another kind of thing is if it kind of fail with that other thing, which is not making sure the policy does what we think it does. For Okta, a common pattern is, okay, we're going to make MFA mandatory, but we know not all our users have it. So we're going to enable the self-registration option. So when they first log in, they can enable it. And I think the fun thing there is, okay, that's a great thing, when it's people that are logging in actively, right, over a course of a couple of weeks, people get their factors enrolled. But what inevitably happens when people take that route is there's accounts that are basically dormant or inactive, right? And so they can be, it could be 6 months from MFA rollout. An attacker gets the password to one of those accounts. They log in. Up comes the self-service thing. Would you like to register an MFA factor? The attacker's, oh, great, sure, I'll do that. It's an MFA factor they control, and then they're in your system, right? And all that MFA policy that you've implemented has not been effective. So another critical one there is that we get the policy right to really enforce that MFA is being used, rather than just looking and seeing like what exists at the moment, right? And kind of prevents us from protects us from social engineering and some other things. And then the final one, even if you get those two things right, there's a lot of services, GitHub, Databricks, Snowflake being great examples. They're very kind of technical things oriented towards a technical developer type audience, super critical, full of intellectual property, personal information, all these things. And they all not only support user-generated API tokens, it kind of varies in keeping with the people who tend to use these products. It's almost like a very natural and normal part of working with these things, is that users log in, they present their MFA token, they log into Databricks, and they generate a token so that they can run a script that kind of manually moves some data around or something like that. And so especially if these user-generated tokens are not controlled, they're giving you the same privilege that user has, especially if they haven't constrained the scope. And they're just sitting, they're not controlled in any way. They're not, you don't have to use MFA to use them. They could be sitting on a user's workstation. They can never expire, whatever else. So there's a lot of things like this where we think, oh, we got all the things right. We required MFA, strong MFA on authentication. We make sure that we treat the weakest factor as the effective factor for a user. But because we didn't control how users generate tokens, especially technical users accessing these sort of things, effectively, there's paths that we're not aware of that completely bypass MFA, right? So what we think to be this control state is not the control state. So I think all that stuff relates to, kind of making MFA that true second layer of defense that we expect it to be. Second kind of anti-pattern, and that's kind of relating to the identity and defense theme. Second layer, this is more like a missed opportunity than one we typically kind of mess up. A great opportunity for a second layer of defense because attacker techniques change constantly, but their goals remain roughly the same, right? They're always trying to get to that sensitive data, and to do that, they must, abuse privilege or they must create, new privilege, right? So very common that they're going to create a new user, assign privilege to an account they control, something like that. So, very simple thing we can do there is just, that we all hopefully, already do to some extent, is we have very, very strict procedures for how privilege change occurs, not just on-prem, but in the cloud. How do service principals get created? How do users get created? How does, any kind of privilege get assigned to them? You remember that midnight Blizzard Microsoft breach we talked about, very powerful privileges being assigned to service principals by other random service principals, right? Like that kind of thing. So in an ideal world, we have procedures that very tightly specify how these things happen, only from managed devices, only from this set of users, only from these IPs. We have policy controls that enforce those things, and then critically, we have monitoring that watches for failed attempts to do these things or for abnormal manipulation of privilege. And that's a huge opportunity we have here, because when it comes to the initial access, there's tons and tons of noise, tons and tons of variety to what's going on. Abnormality-based detections can be a little bit sketchy there, can be noisy. We have to do a lot of looking for the known bad, on kind of initial access type, space. When we get to the, privilege manipulation stuff, we control how predictable this behavior is. It's often a small set of people. It's rare, rare relative to other activity. And often we can do that kind of allow less type thing of anything that's not normal, we're going to send straight to the SOC, right? So it's the best opportunity we have, in my opinion, to catch an attacker that's sophisticated enough to slip through those initial level defenses that are all based on looking for the known bad thing, right? Clever enough to slip through that, but to slip through the second layer here, if we've implemented it properly, they have to blend in with the privilege manipulation that's going on normally, right? And really raises the bar for them, especially if they slip up and try to, add a privilege it seems like they should be able to add, or add a user in a way that they're not just used to doing in environment after environment after environment, and they get like they get a 403 or whatever, because we've set up constraints on how these things can actually be changed, such that even though they think they have the privilege to manipulate this privilege, they're doing it in an unusual way, which both is denied and then sets off the monitoring that says, oh, someone's, anyone internal would know they couldn't do this. Someone else is kind of doing things here. So that's another example of anti-pattern where we really just erode ourselves when it comes to defense in depth, and more of a missed opportunity situation, or a place where we don't go far enough necessarily, but kind of another one there. Third one that we're all probably have talked about to death at one point or another is access from unmanaged devices. A great ideal thing is we only want to have access from managed devices. Can be often hard to actually enforce, right? Because users are users, right? But especially important when it comes to SaaS apps and things like that. Because if you think about a SaaS app, the path to compromise can be get the password, log in, and then you're not really going to any company infrastructure or things like that. So if you're setting controls on that SaaS app, it's got to be like in Databricks, in Snowflake, in whatever. You're kind of setting, like, managing a bunch of different set of controls that may not be consistent. Honestly, a lot of these things do not give us a great level of visibility, or a great level of controls, or they don't even necessarily work right, which is another whole fun set of things. So if the users can log into critical sensitive SaaS apps like CrowdStrike or Databricks or Snowflake, or even things like Slack potentially, from any device, the barrier for a hacker is basically can they get past your IDP, maybe some controls that have been implemented within whatever it is, but you're probably but those are going to be difficult controls to maintain. Some fun background things there. Beyond Corp, people from Google about how they approach security, thinking of both the device and the user as part of the story about the privilege they get, whether authentication, authorization are possible. Great paper on this kind of topic and how they do security, but more just kind of background stuff. But yeah, just kind of drilling on that point then, for your sensitive SaaS apps, if you're requiring, or if we're requiring kind of like, say, step up auth, for something like Okta that requires the user to have using hardware MFA coming in from a managed device, what we've effectively done is for every sensitive SaaS app that we have, we've set up a whole second layer of controls that's consistent across all the apps, right? It's whatever the controls on the endpoint are, and just we've kind of raised the bar for most attackers, right? And in order to use those credentials that they've stolen, or even in some cases like the session cookie they've stolen or something like that, they have to have code execution on an endpoint, and they got to kind of run the gauntlet that we've set out for them there with EDR monitoring, reduce privilege on the endpoint, all those kind of fun things. So just we can't do it for everything, right? There's always going to be users who want to do something from an unmanaged device, but at least for those sensitive SaaS apps, if the only thing we do is use step up auth to force the users onto a managed device, we've now added that second layer of defense. And it's no longer, I have Disney on that slide, over this summer, someone got some Slack credentials for them. They downloaded 1 terabyte of data from Slack because I guess Disney must like trade assets and things like that on there, very essential to their business. As a result, Disney's moving away from Slack because that was such a huge issue for them. But all it took was one set of Slack credentials, and they just went and scraped all the stuff that people had helpfully posted to Slack. So I think that's kind of that's a one mistake breach, basically. It was one person's password, huge impact. And that's where kind of forcing through managed devices for all the obvious reasons, but also because for SaaS in the cloud, it gives you that second layer, to make it so it's not a one mistake situation. And then I think final thing to touch on kind of quickly here is a little bit abstract, but you can let's say you get all these controls right. You're forcing for SaaS apps, you're forcing access through managed devices to add another layer of controls there. You have MFA implemented properly. You have strong hardware MFA on privileged accounts. You're monitoring privilege manipulation, and you have it tightly controlled, to kind of as a kind of a trap for attackers, or make it more difficult for them and easier to detect. There's still a kind of category of error that you can make that basically renders all of that kind of useless as a second layer. And basically what it comes down to is all those other controls, you're kind of creating like an array of fortifications, kind of a wall or something like that, or like a, whatever it is, a castle, whatever. And frequently what we kind of tend to miss is that, if it's very hard to get through all that, but we've left a way that attackers can just, walk around the side, right? Because we haven't actually thought about the identity infrastructure, how it all connects together. And, you've left weaknesses that attackers who do think that way, right? They don't want to like tunnel under a wall. They don't want to like blow up, kind of weave in and out a bunch of fortifications. They want the easiest path to the objective they're looking for. And so they do tend to think in terms of like, what is the actual entire holistic picture of the identity infrastructure, and how can they get to what they're after in the lowest effort way. And often, if we don't think in this way, in this holistic way, we leave paths open for them to kind of just bypass all this stuff that we've set up correctly. A great example of that was Okta getting breached about a year ago. Attackers breached their support unit even, which was outsourced to Romania, and then started trying to pivot into customer environments, including ours. And so there's a number of layers of that, right? Like we're all defending our own stuff, and we think Okta, we can trust Okta, right? They're kind of like the linchpin of all this stuff. They're our authentication, we can trust them. And of course, obviously not, right? It wasn't even like the main Okta that was breached. It was kind of, the support group. But beyond that, so there's that supply chain stuff. But even beyond that, I think some fun examples here with Okta. I think Scattered Spider is a fun threat actor with Okta. One of the things that they love to do is with Okta, if you authenticate using Active Directory for authentication, the way that works is the user enters their password to Okta, and then there's an agent running on some server in your environment. And Okta sends the password down in clear text to that agent. It authenticates against Active Directory and responds back, kind of yes or no, should we approve this authentication? So obvious, attack path there for an attacker on-prem. If they get to the server with that agent, they can steal clear text passwords and do other things. But what kind of Scattered Spider type people like to do is they log into Okta with some level of privilege, and they just register their own authentication agent if you haven't kind of locked that down. And then what that does is every time someone tries to log in addition to sending the password to a legitimate agent, it sends it to their agent, which is running on their infrastructure, probably, somewhere, and then lets them, note that password down and then say yes or no, should we approve this authentication thing. So what they've just done is they're now stealing passwords and are now completely bypassed all your authentication controls just by registering new identity infrastructure, that's kind of unsanctioned, right? So it's an interesting one of these kind of end around routes where we want to really make sure we actually understand our identity infrastructure, how it's all connected, and that it's not changing like unexpectedly, like, oh, there's a new authentication agent, and that's odd, so kind of like actively making sure that, the kind of it's staying the thing we think it is, right? Another great example of this, kind of a little bit different, but if we think about like setting the controls on Okta accounts, right? A mistake I made myself and see all the time is people kind of look at their Okta accounts and they think, okay, here's the controls I'm going to apply to the most privileged ones, the ones with super administrator, kind of global admin, domain admin for Okta. And then here's the level of controls that I'm going to apply to the accounts that are less privileged, right? And great on paper, right? You can kind of quantify, oh, how does this reduce my risk, all these things. But what's often missed is that some of the accounts that will fall into that unprivileged category, ones that have, they don't have super admin, they don't have any of these things, don't even read-only admin, so we're going to put some fairly lax constraints on these. But as soon as that user logs in, they up come like a list of tiles, and it's like, password safe, LastPass, right, CrowdStrike, all these things that can be used to completely breach your environment and attack achieve attacker objectives. And so really, I think the thing that I would argue for is, when considering how to protect accounts, you want to really consider the full reach of what they can get to, not just literally what does the Okta account, do, but what are the tiles that user can click on once they kind of authenticate. And then so I think what that does is it leads to, when you're thinking about what's my policy based on my risk tolerance, for different levels of privilege, kind of helps to do that in an accurate way, right? And then and avoid the situation where effectively we've kind of put like a lax set of controls that are not actually within our risk tolerance on a user that's actually greatly privileged, because the way we're understanding privilege is kind of very kind of solipsistic, or just looking at the individual user and not the context of the identity controls and how all this fits together. So little running through those a little bit quick. I think another fun one that I'll just touch on briefly is service accounts getting synced around. We all have our on-prem service accounts. We all have our things that sync from AD to Azure, Entra ID now, or sync to Okta. Very common things that happen is we have our service account from on-prem get synced to one of these places. We don't even realize it's happened. Kind of gets missed when we're applying controls and other things until eventually an attacker gets the password maybe to the on-prem service account. Oh, let's try it in Okta. Let's try it in Enter ID. Often a situation where they are the first person to log in and they get that self-service registration of MFA, and they're kind of running as an account that we don't even realize exists, kind of outside of on-prem, but it does, because at one point, the sync agent kind of moved it over and then we kind of forgot about it. So I think that's the last anti-pattern there that I wanted to focus on. But really, I think the thing for me is so many of these breaches, again, especially when they involve the cloud, when they involve SaaS, really do come down to one mistake or two mistakes. And I think that's because, just kind of beating a dead horse, we're not really taking care of the basic obvious things when it comes to posture, when it comes to, kind of identity defense in depth, really creating, that kind of identity defense in depth. And I think, so part of that is because detection has been working so well recently, for a lot of positive things there. But also I think it's, then business friction and all these kind of things. But I think it's also because we sometimes think we've achieved defense in depth, right? But we really haven't. And I think, these kind of four things, there's more than just these four things, but I think these four things are very common ways where, as defenders, we think we have this great defense in depth when it comes to identity. But for the attacks that actually happen, it does end up being these scenarios where it's kind of one mistake. And as long as that's sort of like the situation, right, we continue to lose as defenders, because that's a very low bar. We must never make a mistake ever, or a very high bar. We must never make a mistake at any time. So I think that's kind of the gist of the talk. From my view, we kind of, there's a lot of a huge opportunity to kind of enhance defense in depth, enhance when it comes to identity, enhance posture defenses when it comes to identity, and think a little bit more clearly about why the things we're doing are not working. And then as a result, attackers are still going to do the things they're doing, but at least make them work a little harder to kind of get to their objectives. And then as a result, give ourselves a little bit more of a chance. So I think that's the main talk on my side. I was going to leave a little room for questions. I'm not quite sure how that works, but I think that's the kind of end of the talk there.